Hello, and welcome to the How I Tested That podcast. I'm your host, David J. Bland. I'm an author and advisor, and I'm fascinated with testing early-stage ideas. I've helped companies all around the world, and in this podcast, I connect with entrepreneurs and innovators who had the courage to test their ideas with real people in the market, with sometimes surprising results. Please join us as we explore the ups and downs of experimentation together. In this episode, I'm joined by Bill Fienup. He's the co-founder of mHUB, one of the world's leading HardTech innovation centers located in Chicago, Illinois. We explore how he went from building Nerf gun prototypes at MIT to creating a space where thousands of hardware founders can prototype, test, and scale physical products. What started out as a meetup group and a spreadsheet grew into a full ecosystem with millions of dollars in equipment and billions of dollars in economic impact. Bill shares how to test hardware ideas without burning capital, why most teams overfocus on feasibility instead of desirability, and how to validate what people will actually pay before you build. If you're working on physical products or funding them, this episode is a masterclass in how to test before you invest. Enjoy my conversation with Bill Fienup. Welcome to the podcast, Bill.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you here. I've learned about mHUB in the past, and coincidentally, I came across your profile. I was like, oh, I could actually maybe get Bill on here to talk about mHUB. So I'm really happy about that. My trips to Chicago have been amazing. Every time I've been there, I've been in these really cool maker spaces or hubs, and I was just fascinated. I think the first time I visited Chicago for that type of stuff was maybe like 2011 or 10 or so. And there was all this like lean startup movement going on, and there's lean startup circles going on and everything. I actually went to a lean startup circle in Chicago early on. And I was just fascinated by the creativity and the resilience of everybody there. And I'm just so happy to have you on here to share some insights of that community and what you've been building.
Yeah, I'm happy to share all the insights. It's been an exciting journey.
Yeah. So maybe you start a little bit with your background. I think what fascinated me the most was you have this interesting mix of engineering, and you also have your background at IDEO, which I'm a huge fan of. And maybe just give us a little bit of your background and how it kind of led into what is the beginning of mHUB was.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to keep that part brief. I guess it really started, when I was in high school, and I kept reading about MIT and some of these research labs, and I didn't really know what MIT was, early on in like fourth or fifth or sixth grade. And I finally discovered it was like a college that you could go to after high school. But I really set my eyes on that, career, because I was like an inventor when I was a kid. I would modify Nerf guns and super soakers, try to get them to shoot farther, figure out how they worked. I would have like Rube Goldberg contraptions in my bedroom to turn the light switch on and off. So I was just like an engineer at heart. And so I set on getting into MIT, and I studied mechanical engineering there. I did a bachelor's degree there as well as a master's. And in the master's program, I really got into product development and design. I was actually sponsored by Hasbro, and I worked on, my dream job came true. I got to actually design, and build Nerf guns and super soakers. So we had a bunch of prototypes, and there's a lot of like testing and iteration and refinement. And that's probably where I really learned how to do this process of like generating a bunch of ideas. We had hundreds of ideas, and then we would kind of present the best 30 concepts that were just sketched out. And then we ended up prototyping 10 of those, because some of them didn't really meet their product lines, or they couldn't see them being commercialized under their brand. But then we built 10 prototypes, and some of them like totally failed. And others like seemed like they could work if we just tweaked them a little bit more. And so we'd be iterating on these concepts, and they were like slow flying darts. This is like back when the Matrix came out, and they had those slow flying, those like the bullet time. And so we had these concepts where these darts, were powered by compressed air, and they would like slowly fly, sort of like letting a balloon out. And then we had like Nerf grenades and laminar flow water guns, all these concepts. And finally, we got to the point where we were prototyping two things. They were like tracer darts. So they had LEDs in the darts, and they would charge in the blaster. And then as soon as they fired, they would light up. And then we had this device that was inspired by like video games where you shoot kind of an energy ball from your hand. And we prototyped and iterated that, and that actually got commercialized. So kind of a tangent there, but I think it's important to the story of like how I started to think about building and iterating and, 3D printing and then testing and then refining and then like design for manufacturing. After MIT, I wanted to continue that product design and development. And, my first job out of college was at IDEO in Chicago. And actually at the time, they were up in Evanston, Illinois. So I moved to Chicago to work for IDEO and did a lot of product development and consulting. And I focused in like med device. And, there's another project where we were working on a car for the Chinese and the European market. And I think what like the real lesson that I learned there is like you really have to understand your customer. And that's key throughout like all my experiences. And like the biggest message I tell startups at mHUB is like you have to be identifying, well, first you have to identify who your customer is, what their needs are, and then you have to be solving a problem they care about. And for the business to work, they have to be willing to part with their money to pay for your solution. And for that to all work out, you have to produce that solution at a lower cost so that there's enough margin to make the business run. But at IDEO, we would do primary and secondary research. We would go to the Chinese and European markets and interview people. And I remember this was actually when the Chicago Bears were in the Super Bowl. I was in Beijing at the time, and I was a little disappointed that finally we get to the Super Bowl and I can't watch the game. But that's kind of what you have to do. You have to be on the ground, understanding the needs of your customer and doing research and figuring out how they are using, your product or similar products so that you are designing the right features that people care about. So that, I think that really kicked off my career in product development. From there, I went to Insight Product Development, which is now owned by Numera. And I worked on medical devices and, from drug delivery to surgical handpieces to periphery devices. I kind of use similar frameworks there of really identifying and defining the requirements first. And those are based off of, input from user research and then, developing and testing and iterating. That was like kind of the foundation of my career. And then I got the itch to become an entrepreneur after about 7 years of consulting. And that's where there was this time where I felt like alone in my apartment trying to build a startup company without the resources that I had at MIT or at IDEO. And I didn't have people to bounce ideas off of. I didn't have the right tools. I had to go to my friends that had access to 3D printers and laser cutters at their universities to prototype some hardware that I needed. And there were so many challenges and barriers that I experienced from manufacturers not wanting to work with me because I wanted 10 units of a product to, raising capital and not even knowing what I should know to build a startup company. And, I think that's when I got the idea to let's solve that problem. Let's build a hyper resource environment where you have a group of like-minded people that are entrepreneurs, engineers that are sharing tools, surrounded in a community of mentorship and manufacturers and access to capital. And those are some of the ingredients you need to be successful. And that's what I set out to build with mHUB.
Wow, that's such an amazing journey. I mean, from playing with Nerf guns in your bedroom to actually working on Nerf guns, it must have been surreal, to actually experience that. And then to apply this thinking in so many different areas, to do it on toys is one, to do it on medical devices is quite another with the constraints and everything that you have there. So that's pretty impressive. I'm wondering, you mentioned a couple of things there I want to unpack a little bit before we move on. One is, you have to know your customer really well. And I know coming from IDEO background, the way we frame it anyway, and also in testing business ideas is desirable, viable, feasible. And so a lot of what we say is, there's a lot of desirability risk with your customer. Do you understand their needs, their jobs to be done, their pains, their gains, all that. But then you mentioned something really quickly about, will they hand over their wallet or will they pay, which I categorize usually as viability. It's like they could want it, but now they're not going to pay enough. And it's interesting coming from your hardware background because I've found when I go to maker spaces here in California, people are mostly focused on the feasibility side, which is, can we build it? And I'm realizing that is not where your risk is most of the time. Obviously, you have to be able to build something that's going to hold up. But it seems like today, especially today, a lot of the risk is moved to understanding your customers and then will they pay enough for a thing? And it doesn't seem like feasibility is the riskiest thing anymore. What is your take on that?
I totally agree. And I was laughing a little bit when you said that because, at mHUB, like I would agree, feasibility is sort of the focus here because there are a lot of engineers here and like they want to see it work. To me, that's like the most interesting part of that journey is the development and the feasibility. It's the exciting thing. It's what, gets the engineers going. And I think that's why people focus on it. But I totally agree. It's like, that's not like, I would rather have a problem that's worth solving rather than a solution to a problem people don't care about. Because I think that the solution part is the easy part, but it's not the most valuable part. The valuable part is what problem do people care about? What problem is worth spending, years of your life solving? And to me, that's such a harder question than what is the solution? Because and maybe it's just because my expertise are like focused on solutioning where like that is the easy part. It's just the bigger part. And I think the part that pays more, is like, what problem should I focus on? Like that is a more valuable piece of the equation. And then like towards the viability, you have to, and maybe this is where both kind of come in, but you have to do it in a way that there's margin or there's like a sustainable business. And we use this framework at mHUB as well. And I think because of our community is so tech forward and tech focused, we have to supplement our mentorship and our educational curriculum around the viability and customer demand piece. And so a lot of the courses that we teach here, we teach about 45 or 50 courses at mHUB. They're focused on, the business viability and customer discovery because the community is so like tech oriented and, solution driven.
Yeah, I agree. And part of your story about being in your apartment trying to understand how to build a company and not having the resources available. It feels as if you mentioned that led into mHUB. Maybe talk a little bit about that and how did that start? What was that first test or what did you learn along the way? Because I can imagine how hard it would be to create something like you have. So I'm really curious how you sort of navigated that.
Yeah, I think it was helpful because like in Chicago's got a big community. And I was like, I guess after college and when I got in, started working at IDEO and Insight Product Development, I did spend a lot of my time in these like maker groups and I would go to meetup groups. And I think that's kind of like where the community started and where there was support, at least at the time. There was this group called Maker Biz in Chicago. And there were like about 300 members. It was a very large kind of, there was a Google group and then a meetup group. And we would meet once a month in different locations in Chicago. And this was sort of like the genesis of the community that started mHUB. And like any other product, like you want to build a prototype to a product before you launch it, right? And I built a prototype to mHUB called Catalyze Chicago. We incorporated on August 2nd, 2013, and then opened up in February of 2014. And we had this prototype for about 3 years before we launched as mHUB officially. But like what we found in the MakerBiz community is that we would share kind of the pain points that everybody had trying to build a physical product business. And one of the pain points was just having access to space and equipment and manufacturing connections and like the education, kind of all the pain points that I experienced, alone in my apartment. And it was validating, you have a hypothesis of like, hey, these are the pain points that I'm experiencing, but do other people care about it, right? Like, do other customers want a solution to these problems? And so I would meet in the group and like hear what everyone was struggling with. I built out like a portal. It was actually just a Google spreadsheet for like manufacturers, so we could connect the group and get feedback, and you could sort by like material or, by manufacturing process. And we just build a collective list of like, oh, I use this manufacturer to CNC this part or to water jet this part or to 3D print or laser cut or injection mold. So we had all these processes baked in this spreadsheet. But I think what people really need was like not just a community that met once a month, but really was a bit more engaged. And so I asked the community, if it would be helpful to have a physical location, where we could all work next to each other and build out our businesses and share equipment and share, resources and, skills and talent and knowledge that we had to lower the cost and accelerate faster. And so, that's where like the idea of mHUB came about is, let's group together. Maybe we pool our resources together and buy certain pieces of equipment or share. Or, a lot of people had their own shop equipment, like their own laser cutters and 3D printers and bandsaws. And I found a place in Chicago that was willing to do month-to-month rent, which was like, I think that was one of the key pieces. I got lucky, and most places here want like 3-year commitment, and that wasn't going to work like when you're building a business. And we didn't know if it was going to fail, but we rented 2,000 square feet, and we doubled to 4,000 square feet, and then we doubled again to 8,000 square feet. So after 6 months, we were up at 8,000 square feet, and we had a lot of traction. And that was actually when I met Haven Allen from World Business Chicago. I mean, he had a manufacturing initiative there to create growth in the economy through the manufacturing industry, job growth, as well. So that's when we realized our missions were aligned. I was coming from more of the entrepreneurial side, trying to get access to resources for startups, and Haven was trying to build out and bolster the manufacturing economy. And so, from after 6 months of starting Catalyze Chicago, Haven and I partnered to build mHUB. And there's so much I learned just from understanding, building a team and founders, finding someone who, could really pull in the proper connections to build out the ecosystem that we needed, as well as doing the, more focusing on the business side and being a leader. So there's I learned so much about building the right team throughout kind of all the startups that I've launched. And Haven was the perfect partner to come in and really create the vision and drive things forward.
That's amazing. I feel as if, you started with the existing community. You put together a spreadsheet, started working through literally just have a Google sheet, and then work your way into a space, and then the doubling of the size of the space. I'm interested in along that journey, and maybe even beyond that, where are some things you thought, oh, this is a sure win, but it went sideways, or something you tried and it didn't turn out the way you expected, but you still learned from it and used it to shape what you did after?
I mean, this is every day. When you launch something, you're literally doing all the jobs. You're wearing all the hats. I was taking out the trash. I was cleaning the dishes. I was fixing the air conditioning, But there were other lessons. The building we had they had hard keys, and we couldn't get every member a key to the building and then to our room. And so we had to do these crazy workarounds, and we built our own Arduino-based RFID card reader, because we couldn't afford buying one of these controlled systems. And my God, that it usually worked. I would say about 99.9% of the time it worked flawlessly, but the 0.1% of the time it didn't work was a huge headache. We were open 24 hours, and there was a time that some of our companies, they have overseas suppliers, and they would work the night shifts. And I remember one of our members would call me I had my number there that they could call to get access. There was a Google number, and at 2 a.m. I had to go open the door to let people in, because the Arduino, I think after 56 days the clock kind of rolls over. And a lot of this stuff would break every so often. And then we found a workaround to that issue. But I think that was one of our struggles. But, we were scrappy. We built our own furniture. One of the major projects that sort of when a new member came in, they would build their own desk. And it was it was a great way to learn how to use all the tools in the shop, and a way to meet the community, and almost a pledge brother, where you have an initiation, you gotta do something to join. So, we actually we would go to the hardware store and get plywood and, build our own furniture and desks for people to work on. So very bootstrapped and very scrappy. And we've grown quite a bit since then.
It reminds me a little bit, a very different type of co-working facility, but there's some folks I met before who actually didn't charge for their community, but people had to contribute to the community to be a part of it. And it really weeded out pretty quickly the folks that weren't a good fit, because as soon as money changes hands, it's, the Wi-Fi doesn't work. I pay for this. Why is the Wi-Fi bad? But if you're not paying for it or you're paying a really low fee, it's like, well, how do we fix the Wi-Fi together? It's a very different conversation. So I love that you built your own furniture and just were really scrappy about it. And something you said that I'm really wondering, is this still an issue? Is you mentioned that one of the reasons behind this space was that it's really hard to work with manufacturing companies and get 10 units or it is small batch because you don't know what the finished product is exactly going to be until you can test in small batch. But these large manufacturers, of course, they want big batches because they want to do a run. How much of that is still an issue or still holding back entrepreneurs who want to do something with hardware? Like, how is it today versus back in 2013 or 2014?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is like one of the main problems that mHUB is solving is that we have a facility where you can prototype and iterate, and we've got $6 million worth of equipment, in our machine shop. And so I would say, like, if you're in Chicago, it's definitely not an issue, or if you have access to, a similar facility in your city. But I would say things have gotten a lot easier than they were 10 years ago. I would say that like the 3D printers really democratized sort of the making movement and allowed people to have access to tools for relatively cheap. In my consulting days, like 3D printers were really expensive. I mean, I actually worked at Z Corp when I was an undergrad at MIT, but there was another 3D printing company that got bought out. But that's when like 3D printers were really expensive. And now they're very cheap, so they're easy to procure and print your own parts, or there's so many ways to outsource fabrication. So I'd say like, with Xometry or 3D hubs, Proto Labs, there's a lot of tools where sort of they are the Ubers, for manufacturers where you can upload a file and get a part. And that like now you can get a part in maybe a week, but if you're at mHUB, you can get that part in, hours and then do another design and iterate. And so I think the speed of iterations, if you have your own tools on site where you can, test quickly and then modify and then reprint or remachine, you can develop much faster. So I think a lot of people still have access to those tools a lot more than they did, say, 10 years ago, but you can really accelerate the development if you have access to them yourself.
Yeah, I do think it's changing. I do think 3D printers, I'm in agreement there, that especially with the price coming down and just the technology and having digital models you can pull from. I'm wondering on your side, so for example, I had the pleasure of meeting like Tom Chi back in the day of Google Glass, and he was post Google Glass doing these like rapid iterations of things where they'd have customers come in and they would test with customers, almost like a Shenzhen kind of thing. And then they would have to make iterations within like the hour. and then another wave of customers would come in. And I thought it was really cool. It was also it was just breaking this model of what this could look like in hardware. And I'm wondering on your side, you teach a lot of classes at mHUB and you've been doing this a while and you're an expert in this area. Like, how are you teaching these principles of iteration, figuring out if that customer has the problem or not? Or like, if you could just share some examples of how you're trying to approach that.
Yeah, I think we really try to start with the customer. First, identifying who your customer is, what their needs are. And you can do that through primary or secondary research, but like and secondary research is a lot easier now with some of the LLM models. But like really talking to a customer is so important and seeing if they share that same pain point, maybe that you had or that you've observed, and then understanding how much they're willing to pay for that feature. I teach a class with a product called the Can Chill that I've been developing just so I can stay on top of mentoring the community here. And it's a device that chills a canned beverage. And throughout that process, like I've learned, so much. And this was more of a pain point that I had. Like I really enjoy drinking cold Red Bull, but there's been, at the office, there's been a couple of problems where I would forget that I put one in a freezer and it would explode. And this was back when I was at Insight Product Development. I built my own Red Bull chiller that it was just like a machined block of aluminum with a cooling coil around it. And that it had a plexiglass tube that was about 3 or 4 feet tall. And I hooked up compressed air to it. So it was more like a cannon. You would drop a can in there and it would chill and then it would shoot up and you could catch it. And what was interesting and a little unexpected is that it only took about like 3 minutes to cool the Red Bull from room temperature, down to like 34 degrees because it worked off of conduction. And so I love being my own customer when developing a product. But then like the question is like, do other people value this solution? And I can talk a little bit about like in this class that I teach, like, I go through kind of the framework you've been talking about, like the customer discovery, the feasibility, the viability. And at first you take these broad circles around it. Like, so the first step in the can chill was like, are people searching how do you chill a beer in under 5 minutes? So you can like look at just the amount of Google pages. I think like when I started, there was 64 million Google pages just on like that problem. And so that can kind of quantify. And then you look at the competitive landscape, you look at the IP, you see, like a lot of people get so discouraged when they see a competitor's product. And like, that just validates that other people experience this problem, so you shouldn't get discouraged. You should either be like really happy that you don't have to spend 2 years building out your own custom solution and you could just buy it, because it's way less expensive to buy, say a $50 product than it is to invent it. So you should either be happy that you could just purchase a solution, or you should be happy if you're still passionate and perfecting it, you should be happy that other people experience this pain point because it validates your market. And so then there are tools, that you can use to scrape Amazon data, like Unicorn Smasher or Viral Launch. These, I'm not sure if all these tools still exist, but like Jungle Scouts. But you basically can see the size and volume that these products, sell on a daily basis and look at price history. But that gives you like, a size of, how many people are actually buying competitive solutions. And after that, it's like important are you able to protect this business? It's more of the viability piece, but, is there IP, is there freedom to operate in terms of the IP, the intellectual property? So then, you can do some patent searches. And then it comes down to like, is this a feasible product? So in the class I teach, I go through a spreadsheet of, calculating what size would this be if the goal is to chill a 12 or 16 ounce can from room temperature down to, 34 degrees. And just calculating, basically it's a spreadsheet of actual engineering calculations where you have, the thermal mass of your cooling device and, how much energy is it do you have to transfer into a can, a 12 ounce can or a 16 ounce can. And so how big is this device going to be? I'm just trying to figure out, is it going to be the size of a ice cream container or is it going to be the size of a refrigerator, And so those are kind of the big swaths that you do first. And then, after you kind of march around that circle of customer discovery, feasibility, viability, then you de-risk all of those. And then you zoom in a little bit deeper. You spend more time, more money de-risking each of those categories with, I did finite element analysis on some of my designs and fluid flow and understanding the thermodynamics, with the heat transfer and figuring out how quickly it was going to cool. Then I did some 3D printing and, had to machine some parts to get the materials, the proper materials, was with the heat transfer properties. And so you continually do this testing on the feasibility front. And then on the customer side, I actually built out a website with renderings of the product before I even started to manufacture it. And I wanted to test, like, do people click on the buy now button? And when they clicked the buy now, it said, sorry, this product is out of stock. Put your email address in and I'll let you know when it's available. But then I got a sense of like what my customer acquisition cost was going to be to acquire a customer. And so I had some ads running on a website with a product that didn't exist just to figure out if people would buy it. And I think that's kind of the diligence that you need to do when you're exploring what features should be in a product. You can do some quick A/B testing of pricing and features and colors. And I think I learned a lot from that type of testing.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I think this idea of like testing with people versus testing on people, like testing with your customers to see if they would actually want this. I think that's always a tricky balance in trying to figure out where the line is individually. I know I've gone to websites where I often wondered if the product existed because it's out of stock, but sometimes they're just always out of stock and you're like, what's going on? But I think this idea of testing the demand and seeing are people willing to pre-order this, or I know Kickstarter and different crowdfunding campaigns are also, it's how I've bought hardware in the past, where I was like a product, I was like, oh, it's a specific need I have. Like I have some hearing needs. And I was like, oh, I'm willing to pay upfront for this because this solves a very specific personal need for me. And for me, it was, headphones. But I feel as if you could spend a lot of money still, even with the 3D practices of building in feasibility land. And I'm wondering from a funding point of view, and this is something I'm always trying to wrangle with my teams, is can we maybe give just like enough funding to start de-risking some of these big circles, as you put it? And then as you find more evidence and you give yourself permission to invest more, you get a little more funding, maybe like in tranches or something. I feel here in Silicon Valley, I still see people get way too much funding for something to build. And they build and the money's gone. I mean, they built it and it looks amazing, but they got the viability wrong, or they got the market wrong. And it's tough to pivot once you've built this thing and now you're trying to figure out how to get it into the right hands. So I'm wondering, like at mHUB, how do you think about these things, or how is it evolving there? Or what do you see from your perspective on this?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely recommend a spiral of like just testing the waters in each of those categories, and then as you de-risk, you invest more time and more money in, you add more people to the project. And like, I think it's so important to test all those categories, because if you just go down the feasibility route, like you could be building the wrong product. And that's like the most expensive mistake. I see it like in the consulting that we do here as well, as like, the customer wants a solution to the wrong thing. And, you burn a lot of money, a lot of time, and you're building the wrong product. And so it really makes sense to de-risk and really figure out what features your customers are willing to pay for, and maybe you have like the idea, right, of like, there is a need, for some solution that addresses this market, but really getting those feature sets right is where you have to talk to your customer and show them prototypes, see how they use them, see what features they gravitate towards. You may decide to remove features because it adds too much cost to the product, or they don't add enough value, or you can't get that product market fit because it's just too darn expensive for that feature that nobody cared about, or I think the other trap that people fall into is like, there's a loud voice from 1% of the market that is driving all your decisions. And, you should be designing the product for the 80% of the market because that's where your volume is going to be. And, you might need to ignore kind of the loud voices that are really demanding these expensive, things just because of their unique situations. I think that's kind of an important lesson too, is like, at mHUB, we poll our community multiple times. We have a survey that we send out every year to get feedback on how we can improve the organization, what tools should be in the shop. You got to like take all that information in to make all the decisions.
Yeah, I imagine it's a challenge sorting through all of that. And then it's up to you and your co-founders and your team to make what you think is the best. How are you envisioning mHUB, over the next year or so? What gets you excited about?
We've got so many entrepreneurs in this community, and the problems that they're solving are impacting the world and humanity. And I love just diving deep with each of them. So we've got a water cohort right now, and typically we have an accelerator program, and there's a med tech category, there's an energy, smart, sustainable manufacturing category, and we've got a water cohort right now that are solving very interesting problems. And I think like helping them navigate, not just the solution, but, how to build the business, I think is really interesting. And I think it's like the magnitude of the problems that these entrepreneurs are pursuing is what really gets me out of bed, and excited to jump in and give them advice and see if we can help them navigate the startup journey. There's so many ups and downs in the startup world that, it's really like a roller coaster. And, the people here are taking huge risks, and they're devoting a lot of their life to building something they're so passionate about. And so you see the excitement here in the community. Over the past 8 years, our community's raised about $2.3 billion in capital. They've generated about $2.2 billion in revenue. They've launched 1,800 products, patented about 600 patents. And they really have an impact on the economy, hiring 7,000 people to join their company, and they're manufacturing locally. So I think it's just really exciting to see the energy and the passion in the community here at mHUB.
That's such an amazing story. I mean, it starts off with a meetup and a Google spreadsheet and month-to-month lease with you hacking the door so people can get in, to having that kind of impact. That's incredible. I'm wondering, for those of you that are listening and you want to reach out, where's the best way to get in contact with you if they're more interested in learning more about mHUB?
Yeah, they can go to our website, mhub.org, or they can email me at bill@mhub.org as well. And I'm happy to help. If you have an idea for a startup company or you're a passionate founder in HardTech, I'm here to help you navigate through the product development journey.
I want to thank you so much for sharing all that. And so we'll put those links in the description and on the podcast detail page. I learned so much just listening to hear you think through all this process. And it's very complimentary to how I think. So I just gets me excited about there's so much more to do in hardware startups. And I love the theme cohorts. There's so much there. I just want to thank you so much for sharing your story with us and all you're doing at mHUB.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to another episode of How I Tested That, where we share stories about experimentation, tips, and tricks. If you learned something new, please recommend us to a friend or colleague. And remember, keep testing your ideas.